Because people will get around Mercy Hill now where we're at, and be like, oh man, you guys got 6 campuses and you got all these different services and you got all these different things you're doing. Of course you guys do that because you have all these volunteers.
Yeah.
Right? That's the thinking. Man, it's because you have all these volunteers you're able to do that.
That's right.
For us, honestly, we never ever, good or bad, hardly ever ask the question, man, do we have enough people to pull this off?
Right.
Because our thinking was, I know my thinking always was like, hey, if God's bringing the growth and the church is growing and there's a need to do something, the spiritual gifts, they exist in the harvest,
Yep.
So like if God's bringing the harvest, then man, I could just be confident that there's going to be more people with the gifts of helping and the gifts of administration, the gifts of serving and the gifts of teaching. And so, man, we're just going to plug away, we're going to start another service. We're going to do whatever. And man, those people that God has gifted, like, man, they're going to kind of rise up.
That's right.
This is Breaking Barriers, where we help pastors and churches grow so that they can go.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Breaking Barriers podcast. This is Pastor Bobby. I'm here with Pastor Jonathan, and we have hopefully a good episode for you today. And so, one of the things we're going to be talking about today is, a lot of times we think, man, I don't want to put too much stress on my church in terms of like more services, more volunteers, more campuses, because that is going to burn people out. That's going to maybe hurt the church. There's a lot of pastors that think that. What we're going to talk about today is actually the other side of that, how at times stress can sort of be the thing that ends up causing the church to grow, multiply leaders, multiply campuses, church plants, all of that. I think we understand this concept outside of the church world. You think about, you can apply this to so many areas of life, but you think about, man, working out, or, just if you have kids, your kids growing and developing, stress plus rest equals growth.
That's right.
That's how life works. So I'll give you a couple examples outside of church, just conceptually. So my son Eli, this past year, he's 12 now, he was 11 then, he went into the 6th grade. And kind of unexpectedly to us, 6th grade was really hard for him. Those first couple months of 6th grade was really hard. He was in more classes. The school day was longer. There were so many different things, and it was just causing him a lot of stress.
Yep.
But the funny thing is, what happens with stress, like we came around him and we tried to support him. By the time he got to the second half of the year, he had grown so much, just like in his mind and personally, that the stuff that was stressing him at the beginning of the year was no longer stressing him halfway through the year. And that's development, right? That's growth. That happens with working out, lifting weights. That happens with running. I've recently gotten more into doing, sauna, cold plunge. It happens with that. You put your body under, a specific stress for a short period of time. And then from that, you get growth, you get a reaction.
It probably would have been easy, like the first reaction when Eli's going through all that stuff. You'd be like, let's remove the stressor.
Right.
And that'd be the wrong thing to do, because he wouldn't grow. If you take the thing that's stressing him, then he wouldn't grow through it.
Yeah, we have to have stress for growth.
Right.
Like I remember, I run ultra marathons now up to like 100 miles. And I remember when I first started, some of those first shorter races that I did, I remember the first ultra I ever did, it was 31 miles, and I got to the end of it, and I told my wife immediately, I said, I cannot imagine how anybody runs further than this.
Right.
I was in so much pain. I was like, I can't even think of any scenario in the world where somebody could run 100 miles or 3 times longer than this,
Right.
But that's how life is, You do something, it's hard, you grow. Next time it's not quite as hard. You're able to maybe take on a larger challenge. And I think all that's pretty straightforward. It's pretty easy to understand. But a lot of times in church life, because, we want to shepherd our people, we want to protect our people, we want to shepherd our staff, we want to protect our staff. Sometimes we can quickly say, and I've been in so many of these conversations, even with people on our staff who I just love dearly. It's so easy to say, hey, the leadership of the church has this vision to do X, and then someone's going to say, man, I just think that's going to be too much. You know, I think that's going to burn people out. I think that's going to overwhelm people. And what happens, especially if we develop this limiting belief where we kind of end up approaching anything new or hard or different with that framework of it's going to be too hard for people.
Right.
We end up kind of taking away what God can do in their growth in those particular situations. And so today, that's kind of the concept that we want to challenge. Jonathan has been actually really helpful kind of creating some concepts around this because, so Jonathan was a member of our church and working for the state convention before he was on staff at Mercy Hill.
Right.
And so, you know, had a pretty good idea of the church, but you kind of
from the outside looking.
Yeah, you get to look under the hood way more when you actually come on staff. And you know, Jonathan is on our executive team, and so you know, I think once Jonathan came on staff, he was able to kind of see, hey, you know, some of the things you guys have done with multiplying services, with multiplying campuses, it has created this stress on the organization that has ended up actually being helpful and good for things like developing volunteers, sending out leaders, church planning, multiplication, all of that stuff. So Jonathan actually developed some kind of concepts around it, maybe some handles, you know, ways to be able to think about it. And so I'm going to kind of pass it over to him and just kind of let him talk about some of that.
Yeah, as you were talking about that, I was remembering, Beck, you called me pretty recently on a Saturday and you were in the middle of a run and I'm like, what are you doing, man? And you're like, I'm running, but I couldn't even hear you like breathing heavy or anything.
I was running easy.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, any running, and when you tell me you're like 15 miles in, and I'm going, how in the world is this happening? So when you're talking about that 30-mile race and how you felt like, how in the world can I go past that? Yeah, I think there's something really to that you got to lean into the stress that I've learned largely from being here. You know, before I got here, I'd gotten acquainted with some of the work that Mac Lake had been doing around like leadership pipeline stuff. And, you know, the principle that he talks about in that is, you know, most of us, if we think back to how we grew, how we learned some sort of new competency in ministry, we end up in a role where the people that were in leadership kind of just toss us into the deep end. And it's kind of like sink or swim kind of moment. Mm-hmm. And, you know, what he's trying to do is sort of say, let's stop throwing people into the deep end and let's prepare them before they jump into the pool for the things that they're gonna take on. And so I was definitely in that kind of thinking as I was coming on staff here. You know, how in the world what kind of systems can we build to help prepare people before we call them up and all of that. And so after a while, I started watching how Mercy Hill is just multiplying. I mean, we talk about multiply everything. Mm-hmm. That's one of the phrases that we use a lot. And so as I watched that happen, you know, whether it's we're multiplying groups, we're multiplying services, we're multiplying campuses, all these kinds of things. And I'm watching something that's taking place where people aren't necessarily ready for what we're calling them into. And there's certainly a level of stress that's providing, especially when I'm in the staff role, like watching how people feel about it.
Yeah.
Hearing them talk about those things, you know, they go into it with some level of trepidation. Gosh, when I'm like exactly what you were talking about as you were introing the whole thing, you know, we hear people say, when we add that new service or we add this other campus, man, it's going to stress our people out. I'm thinking about when we did the Northeast campus, like right there in the middle of COVID, everything was just, you know, everybody was like, we have less people that are available in the church, and we're like, no, let's just go do this thing, and then we're just gonna trust that God's gonna bless it. And so when that happened, it definitely caused a lot of stress on the organization, but also because of that, it just created a moment where leaders had to multiply. And so in watching that and kind of getting under the hood and analyzing what was happening, I think I discovered that it takes two things to really create that sending culture. One of those is that you have to have opportunities that are created for leaders to be able to step into new places of leadership. They may not even be ready for those things yet. And then you also have to have some kind of system where you're preparing them. And so as I was thinking about that, a lot of churches, they will put a lot of energy. I'm not, like knocking on what Mac Lake was doing or anything. Because it's really good stuff that he put out. It's really great stuff. I mean, we use a lot of this stuff that we went through that stuff with him. But I think that a lot of churches can put so much emphasis on the leadership development side of that, and they just never give any opportunity for the person that's been developed to actually do anything with that. So when that happens, you end up with people that have a whole lot of really good group leaders that are kind of sitting on the bench. So the depth chart is like really, really deep, but they're not actually getting to do anything. They may get to step in and have a rep every once in a while, but when it comes to something with some weight to it, some kind of like heavy responsibility ever sitting on their lap or being put on their shoulders, they never get the opportunity to carry that mantle.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, it makes me think about, this is a non-church example, but you're talking about development and opportunity.
That's right.
My dad was a Green Beret in the Special Forces, and, for any of us that are just interested in, Navy SEALs, Green Berets, different high-end government, police, stuff like that. Like, they all have these training programs that they put the guys and girls through. That
super high stress.
Yeah. I mean, they're teaching them. A lot of it is teaching, and they're instructing them, but they have to put them in risk, high-stress situations, because that's what allows them to be able to grow, to be able to face that, like, in the real world.
Right.
It kind of reminded me of that, like just those elements I think are just baked into helping people to grow.
Yeah, they have to have some kind of place to exercise.
Right.
To really stretch their legs and to see, hey, what does it feel like to be in this kind of position doing these kinds of things?
Right.
Yeah. So, as I was kind of trying to figure out what that looked like at Mercy Hill, building up a framework around that. So the churches that would have like a culture of high leadership development, but no opportunities for people to ever exercise that, what you end up with is like a really bloated culture. When I say bloated, bloated things don't really move very fast. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be a church that's much slower to adapt and change to things. They got a whole lot of people sitting in the tank that are ready to lead, but nobody's leading anything. They're not actually multiplying anything. You're
basically just saying bloated in the sense of they have more leaders than opportunities.
That's exactly right.
Right.
That's exactly what I'm getting at. And so then on the other side of that, you can have a church that is constantly creating opportunities for people, but they're never doing anything to train the people up. They're multiplying things, and they're like what Mac was talking about. They're throwing them in the deep end with no resourcing whatsoever to help them. And so that creates an enormously stressful environment that ends up burning people out. And so that you have to have both sides of this thing when you're thinking about
it. Yeah, like going back to what I'm saying, what I was using that example of like special forces or whatever, like you're not going to take a cop that's like, man, been there for a week and be like, hey bud, we're throwing you on the SWAT team.
That's right.
It just it'd be too much.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like there'd be the opportunity, but they didn't have the training, they didn't have the development.
Yeah.
And so those two things have to be kind of married.
Yeah. You throw them into those really stressful circumstances, but then you don't do anything to prepare them.
Right.
So they're left kind of just out to dry.
Right.
So a really, really bad situation there. So you do that over and over and over again in a church culture, and you end up with people just like, hey man, I'm tapping out. I can't do anymore. They kind of get fed up and they're done with the church. It can be very harmful. Mm-hmm. So to one side, when you're talking about how a lot of pastors want to protect the flock, there is a side of that you have to think about. But a lot of us spend way more time protecting people from the stress than we actually do giving them opportunities.
Yeah, because to me, the funny thing is, like thinking about like pastors that were kind of called into ministry kind of earlier, like high school, college. Yep. My guess is many of them actually have the stories in their own life where they were in high school group or whatever, and they showed a little bit of desire for leadership. And then before they knew it, they were preaching a sermon, to their youth group or something like that. And I bet you it was a huge growth opportunity in their life.
I mean, that's my story.
Yeah. I mean, there's thousands of those stories out there. I think that may be helpful for people to take that concept and just say, okay, we're talking about how do you apply that to everybody in the church?
Mm-hmm.
You know, not just people that are going in ministry,
right.
but people that are leading a community group, people that are serving.
So it's just thinking through how do you give people those opportunities to be able to create those stress moments. You know, when you have a church that does neither one of those things, they're not developing leaders and they're not providing any opportunities to stretch people. Well, I mean, that's a pretty boring kind of environment. You know, it's not a lot of multiplication there's no multiplication that's taking place. There's no growth that's taking place. And the church is just kind of sitting there. You know, nobody wants to be in that. And so a lot of churches that are in that kind of place where we have nothing going on when it comes to leadership development or opportunities to see people jump in, and we're just kind of staying the same. They say, what's the first step that we need to take to be able to get to a place of developing ascending culture? And so most of them think the first step needs to be that they start building some leaders. They start doing some leadership development classes or something like that. And what I found at Mercy Hill was the exact opposite. And this is the thing that surprised me. This is what really stuck out, was what I saw happen over and over and over again was we would multiply something like, hey, we're filling up in this service, so let's create another service. And when you do that, that creates a need for some specific things. You know, that creates a need for more volunteer leaders. So you're going to have a team that's serving at one service, and now you're going to have teams that are needed at a second service. And so when that happens, it creates this big vacuum of leadership, and you call all these people to step up to the plate. Mm-hmm. You know, so I watched that happen over and over and over again, and I'm like, and don't we need to take some time to prepare the people? And not because we had conversation around it, but I just watched. The answer to that was no. You know, the answer is let's create the opportunity. Let's call people to step up. And after they step up, then we'll kind of prepare them on the job. So it wasn't like we were leaving them stranded with no training, no help, nothing, no one coming around them. But definitely there was like a decision that was being made. We are going to create stress in the organization, and that is going to force people to rise to the surface so that we can create more leaders. That was perfect.
Yeah, and I would say two things to that, because I think some people can kind of misinterpret what you're saying. We did not have the view of, oh, we're not discipling these people, or we're not equipping them, or we're not training them like we should. We just kind of had the view, hey, a big part of that equipping, a big part of that discipling is actually giving them the opportunity to do it, and then actually come alongside of them and equip them while they're doing it. So we're not saying, man, we just kind of throw people in just to allow that to kind of crush them, you know, like it's not like that at all. It's just a lot of people want to take like, you know, the classroom approach, where it's like, hey, you got to be sitting in some classroom for 9 months before you can do anything.
That's exactly right.
And I think we were taking a little bit more of that kind of special forces approach, like, hey, we're going to give opportunity and we're going to teach at the same time.
Yeah. But leading with the opportunity. So the opportunity comes first. The person steps in. All right, now we're coming alongside you, and we're helping you.
Yeah, I mean, the second thing I would say to that is it's very counterintuitive to the way people think. And, you know, this is maybe kind of the golden nugget of this particular podcast, because the way that you were thinking about it is the way that the vast majority of people think about it.
Yes, yeah.
Because people will get around Mercy Hill now where we're at, you know, and be like, oh, man, you guys got 6 campuses, and you got all these different services, and you got all these different things you're doing. Well, of course you guys do that because you have all these volunteers.
Yeah.
Right? That's the thinking. Man, it's because you have all these volunteers you're able to do that.
That's right.
And for us, honestly, we never, ever, good or bad, hardly ever ask the question, man, do we have enough people to pull this off?
Right.
You know?
Yep.
Because our thinking was, I know my thinking always was like, hey, if God's bringing the growth and the church is growing and there's a need to do something, well, man, you know, the spiritual gifts, they exist in the harvest, you know?
Yep.
So like if God's bringing the harvest, then, man, I could just be confident that there's going to be more people with the gifts of helping and the gifts of administration, the gifts of serving and the gifts of teaching. And so, man, we're just going to plug away, you know, we're going to start another service. We're going to do whatever. And man, those people that God has gifted, like, man, they're going they're going to kind of rise up.
That's right. That's right.
It always seems to happen that way.
It does. It does. It is very counterintuitive. People think, man, let's keep it super safe. Let's protect people slow. Let's move slow. And that ain't how it rolls around here. You know?
Right.
So, one of the questions I think that I get asked most often with other leaders in churches, as a part of Mercy Hill, is they'll say, how in the world do you get so many people to say yes to such big things? Like things like moving their lives to another part of the world, or moving their lives to go plant a church somewhere. And the answer to that's pretty simple. We create this pathway where they're saying a whole bunch of smaller yeses along the way. And so it becomes like this, it becomes a cultural norm for people to say yes to challenging things. It's just we're not asking them to do that biggest thing, move their lives overseas or something like that as the first yes. There's a whole lot of other yeses. So that's the reason that multiplication stuff and all those opportunities come into play. So, when we do something like say to somebody in a group, hey, I see in you that you have the potential to be a group leader. So would you come in and become an apprentice with me? And I'm going to even though you don't feel ready yet, next week, hey, can you lead the prayer time in this group? Hey, the week after that, why don't you lead the discussion and I'll be in there with you? But they feel the weight of that sitting on their shoulders, and when they say yes to doing that, that's one first yes. So you multiply groups, and that creates the need for more group leaders, and that creates the need for more people to say yes, that I'll be a group leader. When you go to multiplying services like we talked about, then it creates more opportunities. People say, yes, I'll commit my time that I'm going to be, a service coordinator that didn't exist, a month ago, and I'm going to put my yes on the table here. So all these other places where people are saying yes to things, and that gets them down the road, you create this culture of, man, the norm is to say yes to whatever God is putting in front of you. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, it makes me think about, I remember early on at Mercy Hill, like when we planted the church, like I was leading a community group, and Pastor Andrew was leading a community group, Pastor Jeremy was leading a community group, and it wasn't long where the church started really growing, and a bunch of college students started coming, and people were getting baptized, and it was kind of, the stuff of like real movement. And I remember, like, man, we were all about like training community group leaders and equipping and doing all the stuff. I mean, we all went to seminary and stuff, so we weren't like anti any of that stuff. But just where we were at with the way that God was growing the church, I remember there was a time where me and Pastor Andrew, like, we just got on a board and we said, okay, we don't have time to go through the community group training with these people, like to spend 9 months, like who are the people that are most likely to be able to lead a community group and not screw it up. And we just identified some people, and we just said, man, they were going from 0 to community group leader.
Right.
As soon as we told them, hey, you're going to be a community group leader. And
that's stress.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And honestly, I mean, people would think there'd be all these horror stories out of that, and there wasn't.
Yeah.
I mean, most of the people did great, and they grew as leaders. The church grew. It was very good.
Yep.
For younger people in our church to see, oh man, they're putting so-and-so in this leadership position. So I just think that's kind of an example, like what you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, there's an element of this where you just have to be a little bit risk tolerant.
Yeah.
Some people that say, hey, we don't want to risk anything. We got to play everything super, super safe around all this. They're not going to see the same kind of growth. They're going to be held back by limited beliefs that you were talking about earlier. They're going to be held back. They're not going to be able to grow because they're not going to be able to produce leaders fast enough.
Well, some of it is this. Yeah, some of it is just this false belief that we think we can like control the outcome in somebody's life.
Right.
Like as if like, hey, what we need to do is like, man, call them to a vision, and pray that God would use this to grow them and help in any way that you can, and just trust God for the results. I mean, sometimes people just say like, oh, well, this for sure is going to burn out the church or whatever. And I'm like, how do you know that? Like, are you a prophet? Like what? Because a lot of times what ends up happening is when you do move forward with something like you're talking about, like a new service or a new campus, God calls up all these leaders that you didn't even know you had.
Right.
Or just brings you leaders like, hey, all of a sudden this person moves into town from 3 states away, and now they're ready to lead at your church.
Yeah, I think it's important. Like you said just a minute ago, that when you were looking for people to carry out those new groups, that you said, who are the people that are the most likely to be able to do this and the thing just not absolutely bomb?
Yeah.
And so I think some people can be listening to this and they can hear us saying things like, man, just be totally loosey-goosey with the whole thing, and whatever God's going to do is what God's going to do. But clearly, I mean, when you were thinking about those things, you had things in mind where a person that has a high likelihood of succeeding as a group leader, what do they look like? It's probably not the person with a whole bunch of sin in their life that's gone like unconfessed. It's probably not a person that's never led a conversation or doesn't have the ability, has terrible EQ, those kinds of things. So you're seeing some things in people, and you're identifying who could be good. It's not like you're letting anybody through just because they're a warm body or something like that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I think the misconception that people have is, if the church is growing in a healthy way, it's never going to feel chaotic. And we just don't believe that.
Yeah.
I mean, you go and look at the book of Acts, and when God was really moving, like I just would imagine to the people that were experiencing it, it probably felt chaotic in the moment.
Yeah.
Where all of a sudden thousands of people are baptized, and now thousands of people need to be ministered to, and they want to lead, and who's going to lead, and who's going to lead the groups, and who's going to lead the house churches. I'm sure a lot of it felt very chaotic.
Yeah.
And for some reason, I don't know, people just have this assumption, like if God's like in it, it's not going to be like feel crazy to us. But I'm like, man, I don't know about that.
Yeah, I think that is a common misconception that people have, is that when a church gets it together and is growing, that it just doesn't feel that way. But I think people around here would say, gosh, a lot of times it does feel chaotic, because just as soon as it feels like we're getting comfortable, okay, let's go multiply this thing now. Mm-hmm. And so it throws everybody back into that stressed kind of environment. Mm-hmm. But what happens is, like you're saying, the new people rise to the surface. People that are already leading in one capacity become better leaders and take on more responsibility, and it just helps us produce more leaders. I think the biggest thing that I did not understand before being on staff here was the multi-site stuff. Mm-hmm. And so I think coming into it, I wasn't super excited about I was coming to the broadcast location is where my family was worshiping and all that. And so the thought of going to a different campus where it's not all live and all that kind of stuff, it was just sort of messing with my head. I wasn't sure if I wanted to do that. And then when I started to see all of the leadership opportunities that were created by the multi-site approach, it totally flipped the way I thought about all of it. It's like the only thing that's going on that's not being replicated at the campuses is the preaching. Everything else, though, mm-hmm. Is creating more and more opportunities. So you get,
and even the preaching is kind of creating more opportunities in some ways.
In some ways, where because we have so many services are going on, that when Pastor Andrew isn't preaching, then there'd
be 10 people.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So I'm just talking about on the reg.
Yeah.
So, it creates more opportunities for more musicians to step in, more opportunities for more people to step into using gifts of hospitality, where people would be sitting on the sidelines feeling like they weren't really needed without all of these other campuses. It just creates this massive sort of opportunity for more people to step into new places.
I think, tell me what you think about this. I think it'd be worth maybe just doing a whole nother episode on what is that progression of kind of stress to the organization, because you have some of that kind of mapped out, right? Like it goes all the way from an additional service to you planting churches.
That's right.
It's probably, do you think we can do a whole episode on that? Just kind of walking
through? It may be a little bit shorter than some of them, but yeah.
Yeah, I think we probably could, just kind of walking through those steps. I'll say one last thing on this is where we can close on this, talking about multi-site being kind of the silver bullet.
Yeah.
I realized a number of years ago, I did my PhD dissertation, and I was doing it on multi-site preaching, different forms of multi-site. And one of the chapters I was trying to engage, because it's so common. There's this critique out there that multi-site, especially if you're using video venues, video preaching, whatever you want to call it, it's kind of like this, it's like this anti-multiplication model, right. It's this, it's this kind of idol of one person, and you know, it's not really multiplying leaders and that sort of thing, you know.
Cult of personality.
Yeah, it's this kind of just undercurrent. Like people just say that, you know, like in seminary circles and stuff. That's just like a common. You would think it's true. Well, I started doing kind of research and kind of diving into like, okay, you know, where are like the epicenters in the United States where multiplication's happening, right? So like church planting is happening, sending out missionaries is happening. And I kind of honestly just kind of backed into this. I realized really quickly, I was like, oh my goodness, this was like 5 years ago, but I started thinking about in the last 20 years, you know, the biggest church planting churches and church planting movements. So you think about like Acts 29, you think about, you know, the Ark Network, Church of the Highlands, you think about Seacoast Church, you think about the Summit Church, and then you realize, wait a minute, these are massive multi-site churches.
Ding, 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 ding.
Like I couldn't even, at the time, I couldn't even come up with one that was at the same scale that wasn't a multi-site church. And so I started kind of going down that road, and I'm like, not only is it not true, you know, when people say like, hey, you know, multi-site is like kind of this anti-multiplication model. It's almost like, man, to multiply the way we're talking about, it maybe is actually this kind of silver bullet for it.
Yeah, man, I think it'll be a lot of fun to talk about that when we get into some of those systems and how it builds upon each other in that next episode.
Yeah.
It'll be fun.
Awesome.
Yeah.